Welcome to the Harvard Business Review IdeaCast. I'm Sarah Green, and I'm joined today by Walter Kiechel, author of The Lords of Strategy, The Secret Intellectual History of the New Corporate World. Walter, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Good to be with you, Sarah.
So the Lords of Strategy of the title are often from consulting or academic backgrounds. And I think to a lot of business people, what many academics call practitioners, somewhat quaintly, there's an open question about whether these kinds of thought leaders really add value to a business. But you seem to be arguing that they've just been misunderstood.
Well, if you believe that it's important for a business to have the facts, and if you believe that it's important for a business to be able to recognize patterns in what's happening to them and how their business works, then I think it's pretty tough to dismiss the role that consultants can play in helping a company out.
So when you talk about the secret intellectual history, why isn't this intellectual history more widely known?
There are three reasons why it's a secret history. One is that, as you suggest in your first question, most people don't know about the role of management consultants in coming up with a lot of the ideas that gave form to the strategy revolution. Secondly, people don't know about just what consultants do in general, I think. Their role, I argue, pound for pound, they're probably the most influential industry in the U.S., and that they affect so many companies' destinies. And then third, just most people haven't heard of the people who were the heroes of this book, people like Bruce Henderson.
Well, let's take a step back and maybe talk a little more about Bruce Henderson, because it's hard to imagine a business world without strategy now. So take us back to a time before businesses had strategy. What did they have instead?
I know, people often think, well, haven't companies always had strategies since the days when they were putting together the pyramids or something like that? The argument of the book is that no, the strategy as we understand it now is a framework that really was only developed in the 60s and 70s. For the first time, companies had a way of thinking in a systematic and integrated way about their costs, their competitors, and their customers, and putting those all together. And it was people like Henderson who founded the Boston Consulting Group who first began to put forward those ideas and talk about the importance of integrating them.
So how did we get from there to here?
Well, strategy has succeeded. Do you know any self-respecting company these days who, if you ask the CEO, do you have a strategy? She would say, well, actually, we don't have one. We're just thinking about that. No, all companies have strategies now. Strategies become installed. The concepts have developed further. And it's almost now so common that it's like speaking prose. We don't think we're doing that until somebody points out, oh, by the way, you're speaking prose.
So when you talk about Bruce Henderson sort of getting the ball rolling, who picked up the ball next?
Well, in some ways it was his best salesman, Bill Bain, who left the Boston Consulting Group to found his own firm, Bain & Company. And because they insisted on working over a period of months and years with companies, they could go and do the kind of analytics that I call greater Taylorism, looking at all their costs and competitors and customer information in a really detailed way. And that kind of analytics is just as important as the concepts of strategy.
So strategy today in business academia is a pretty big deal. But you suggested in the book that maybe it wasn't always that way. Tell us about that.
Well, only through the efforts of people like Michael Porter at the Harvard Business School was strategy really introduced as an academic subject. There was a course at Harvard Business School called Business Policy before that, but they actually resisted a lot of the modern ideas that strategy brought with it, and took Michael Porter really working a revolution first at HBS and then a comparable thing happening at other business schools to get strategy installed as part of the curriculum.
So when we're talking about all of this, it seems like we're mostly talking about the 70s and 80s. What happened to strategy in the 90s?
Well, strategy became things like process engineering, re-engineering. It became things like thinking more systematically about globalization. And it also migrated down to the industry by industry level. Now, if you look at what the strategy consulting firms do, they don't work necessarily on big, grand ideas about strategy. They look about strategy in biochemistry or strategy in consumer marketing. It's become more granular.
And where would you say that strategy is today?
Strategy, there are some companies who say, you know, we don't really do strategy. And what they mean by that is they don't do strategic planning. But you still have to have that fundamental take on who your customers, your competitors, and your costs are and what they are. The next wave of strategy is going to be making it adaptive. by which they mean being able to gather information from everybody in your organization and feed that back into the corporate strategy making intelligence much more quickly and changing more quickly.
I'm curious to know, when you talk about sort of the future of strategy, it sort of begs the question for me of, you've talked about strategy being this idea that revolutionized business. Do you think there's another idea out there that will revolutionize business the same way?
Well, there's been a competition all the way through the last many decades between sort of the strategy numbers people and the people. People like Tom Peters and Bob Waterman with In Search of Excellence, who said, you know, you can't just have a strategy based on numbers, you've also got to think about the people. One of the interesting things that's happening now is that the strategy and the people dimension are finally being combined in ways that I think offer the promise of a whole new set of frameworks and ideas.
I think we can't really have a conversation about strategy without talking about the big disruption of the last couple of years, this big Great Recession that we're in. Where did you see strategy at play there? Was that a strategy failing, or who messed up?
The strategy experts themselves would mostly say it wasn't us. It was those folks in the global financial system. And there was an interesting thing I talk a little bit about in the book, where a lot of them complained that, in fact, the companies that in the big banks and other institutions that got into the most trouble were oftentimes used to be clients of the strategy consulting industry, and then they sort of stopped around the year 2000. So they're prepared to say that those institutions got themselves into trouble. Strategy still has got a place, though. I like the example of, if you don't believe in the importance of strategy, look what happened to the three U.S. domestic automakers. Every consultant I've known who ever worked with one of those came away gnashing her teeth and beating his head because they didn't get serious about thinking about who their customers were, who their competitors were, and what their costs were. If you don't believe in strategy, then you should be prepared to have lots of other parts of the economy be like those three automakers, that is, desolate and uncompetitive on a global basis.
Walter, the book is full of great stories, but I'm curious as to what your favorite story is from this book.
I kind of like the story of Fred Gluck at McKinsey. Fred was born in a tough Brooklyn neighborhood to a poor family. He scrabbled his way up. He became actually a rocket scientist, and then McKinsey hired him because they wanted him to help them figure out technology. But they wouldn't assign him to any consulting assignments, really, because he wasn't their type of guy. He had a flat top and not white shoe like the rest of them. But he did. They'd enabled him to work a little bit on the outside of an assignment with Corning. But they were not sure after a year or so that they wanted to continue to employ Fred, so they called him in one day and they said, well, Fred, I'm not sure that things are going so well. And then his boss got a little uneasy and said, well, by the way, how do you think the assignment is going with Corning? And Fred said, well, you know, he said, I thought about this for a minute, but I'm from a tough neighborhood. I said, I don't think we're delivering on any value to them. And the guy said, what? So his boss that night, so Fred said goodnight, went back, told his team leader that what he'd done, went home, drank several martinis, came back in the next morning. There was a note on his door from the head of the office in New York. Fred, come see me now. Goes in, the guy has his silver tea service out. He said, Fred, how are you? Just want you to know I've been on the phone all night with the head of the project and the guy, the head of the Australian office who's running it for us. And we decided, you're right, we're not delivering full value. We're going to give them half their money back, and we're going to give you more of a chance to learn to become a real consultant.
It's, I think, going to surprise a lot of people who do see consulting as sort of borrowing your watch to tell you the time.
I know, but consultants at their best really are looking for the good ideas. They're looking for the patterns of evidence that can help their clients out. Sure, a lot of them are at the same time kind of super salesmen, and they sort of need to be, but they're also people who are great at pattern recognition and great at digging for evidence. There's a partner at Bain who says, I just like to get into the data so much it's like a gopher in soft dirt.
Walter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah.
That was Walter Kiechel, and the book is The Lures of Strategy. For more, please visit hbr.org.